My name is Danielle Monroe, and at 34 years old, after 12 years of active duty in the United States Army and 2 Bronze Stars for Valor currently gathering dust in a bedside drawer, I have discovered that a decorated captain's rank means absolutely nothing when compared to the whims of a sibling who has never had to scrub a floor or face a consequence. The realization hit me at exactly 8:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, delivered via a cold blue iMessage bubble that felt more like a physical blow than a piece of digital correspondence. This year it's just Victoria's family. You don't count, my mother, Priscilla, had written, the words staring back at me from the OLED screen of my iPhone 15 Pro Max. I sat there in the silence of my kitchen, the morning sun catching the brushed titanium of my 46mm Breitling Neva timer, a watch that had timed extraction windows in the Helmand province but was now merely ticking away the seconds of my own social erasure. I am a veteran of 3 combat tours and a leader who has brought 42-man platoons back from the brink of hell, yet in this sprawling $1.2 million colonial-style house in the upscale suburbs of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, I have been relegated to the status of an uninvited ghost. The air in the house smelled of expensive Meyer Lemon Williams Sonoma hand soap and the faint lingering scent of the high-end Arabica beans I had just ground in my Breville Barista Express, but the atmosphere was suffocatingly heavy with the stench of long-standing favoritism. My sister Victoria, who is 37 and has managed to navigate her entire adult life without holding a single job or paying a single utility bill, had apparently decided that my presence would clutter her vision of a perfect Thanksgiving. She has always been the golden child, the one whose every minor achievement was celebrated with champagne while my actual sacrifices were treated as inconvenient absences that disrupted the family's social calendar. As I stared at the text, my thumb hovered over the glass screen, my knuckles turning a sharp skeletal white as my grip tightened. I could almost hear Victoria's voice in the background of that message, whispering into our mother's ear about how my military rigidity or my supposed distance made the holidays awkward for her children, who were currently enrolled in a private academy costing $32,000 a year per student, all funded by our parents' retirement accounts. I looked out the window at the manicured lawn, the frost clinging to the blades of grass like tiny shards of glass, and I felt a familiar, simmering rage that was far more dangerous than anything I had felt in a briefing room. For years I had played the role of the dutiful daughter, the one who showed up to every brunch at the Oarsman in my dress blues, providing the family with a patriotic talking point to brag about over mimosas, only to be discarded the moment the optics were no longer useful. My father, a man who built his wealth in medical device sales and currently drives a 2024 sapphire blue Porsche Cayenne, had remained silent, a passive observer to Priscilla's gatekeeping. They had moved into this New Hampshire sanctuary to enjoy their golden years, but the walls were built on the shaky foundation of Victoria's narcissism and my own quiet exclusion. The injustice of it felt like a heavy weight in my chest, a pressure more intense than the body armor I wore in the desert. I wasn't just being told I wasn't coming to dinner. I was being told that my entire existence, my service, and my identity as a member of this family were secondary to the comfort of a woman who spends $400 a week on professional blowouts and Pilates classes while I spent my 20s navigating IED-laden roads in an up-armored Humvee. The text was more than a rejection. It was a formal declaration of my status as a non-entity in the very home I was expected to defend. Now let me take you back to how the cracks in this porcelain family facade first began to show, long before the 8:14 a.m. message that finally shattered the illusion for good. The contrast between our lives was not just a gap in income. It was a sickening, visceral manifestation of a hierarchy that had been set in stone before I even shipped off to basic training. While my parents, Jerry and Priscilla, resided in their pristine colonial fortress, I lived in a 900-square-foot apartment in a weathered brick building where the radiator hissed like a wounded animal and the walls were decorated with the Spartan remnants of my service. My living room was a cramped staging area filled with tactical gear, olive drab duffel bags, and the lingering scent of CLP gun oil and desert grit that seemed to have permeated my very soul. Last year, while I was grinding through 12-hour shifts and meticulously paying down the remaining balance of a $45,000 student loan for a degree I had earned through sheer willpower during my deployments, Jerry and Priscilla had blithely dropped $14,000 on a spiritual retreat to Bali for Victoria. They claimed she needed to find her center after the grueling stress of choosing a new marble countertop for her kitchen, yet they never once asked if I needed help with the interest rates on the debt I incurred while serving the country they so loudly claimed to love during 4th of July barbecues. The driveway of their Portsmouth estate told the story better than any ledger ever could, as Victoria's pristine 2024 Carrara white metallic Porsche Cayenne, a lavish gift for her 35th birthday, sat parked like a trophy under the recessed LED soffit lighting. Meanwhile, I climbed every morning into a 2015 tuxedo black Ford F-150 with a staggering 180,000 miles on the odometer, a truck that groaned with the effort of ignition and carried the tools I used to maintain their lifestyle for free. I was the one they called whenever the Nest thermostat malfunctioned or the gutters on the north wing of the house became clogged with damp autumn leaves, and I would spend my rare Saturdays off balanced on an aluminum ladder in the biting New Hampshire wind, clearing debris while Victoria sat inside sipping an $8 oat milk latte. I was the reliable soldier, the one expected to provide free labor and technical expertise because I was tough enough to handle it, while she remained the delicate flower who had to be shielded from the harsh realities of the world. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing that my competence was actually a weapon used against me to justify my exclusion. My parents often spoke in hushed, reverent tones about Victoria's sensitivities, yet they would hand her $5,000 Christmas checks under the table while giving me a $20 Starbucks gift card and a pat on the back for my service. They whispered that my presence was intimidating, that my military posture and the direct way I spoke made the atmosphere too intense for Victoria's fragile disposition, essentially weaponizing my discipline to push me out of the family circle. I had spent years being the person they relied on for every crisis, from fixing a broken furnace in a January blizzard to navigating their complicated tax filings, yet I was rewarded with a text message telling me I didn't count. The injustice of being the family's unpaid handyman and emergency contact while being denied a seat at the table was a jagged shard of glass in my heart, a constant reminder that in the eyes of Jerry and Priscilla, my value was purely utilitarian, while Victoria's value was inherent and unconditional. I was the guardian at the gate, allowed to protect the home and maintain its functions, but never truly permitted to step inside and share the warmth of the fire I helped keep burning. The betrayal reached its agonizing peak on a gray, rain-slicked Tuesday afternoon at exactly 2:45 p.m., a moment that will forever be etched into my memory as the point where my family ties finally dissolved into nothingness. I was sitting at my scarred wooden desk in my small apartment, the sound of the New Hampshire rain drumming relentlessly against the thin glass of the window pane, when I discovered the truth through a leaked email thread that had been accidentally forwarded to me during a discussion about a shared digital photo album. There it was, laid out in cold, digital black and white. Victoria had spent weeks systematically poisoning my parents' minds, whispering that my combat-related PTSD made her precious children feel uncomfortable and that my presence in the house was a simmering fuse just waiting to ignite. My mother, Priscilla, didn't even have the basic human decency or the maternal courage to pick up her $600 iPhone and call me to discuss these fabricated concerns. Instead, she had opted for that chilling one-line text message that arrived like a sniper's bullet at 8:14 a.m. As I sat in the dim light of my living room, I could vividly picture the scene unfolding at their house, a sprawling estate where they were currently gathered around the centerpiece of their social status, a $6,000 hand-carved mahogany dining table that I had personally helped move into the dining room 3 years ago. They were likely sipping vintage Cabernet from Riedel crystal glasses, meticulously planning a Thanksgiving feast that was designed to be a celebration of their collective ego while specifically excluding the daughter who had actually bled and sacrificed to protect the very freedom they took for granted. I could almost smell the cloying floral scent of the $65 Joe Malone pomegranate noir candles flickering on the sideboard, and I could hear Victoria's practiced melodic laugh echoing through the high-ceilinged rooms as she performed the role of the perfect dutiful daughter. It was a calculated erasure, a social assassination carried out by the person who had never seen a day of hardship in her life, yet felt entitled to judge the psychological scars I carried from leading men through the Corangal Valley. The cowardice of it all was what stung the most. The fact that Jerry and Priscilla had allowed themselves to be manipulated into believing that their own child was a threat to the family's manufactured tranquility. They didn't have the strength to look me in the eye and tell me I wasn't welcome. They simply waited until I was out of sight to strike me from the guest list as if I were a line item on a budget that needed to be cut for the sake of efficiency. I thought of the times I had sat in the dark in Afghanistan, clutching a worn photograph of them to keep my spirits up, only to realize that while I was defending their world, they were busy building one that had no room for me. The mahogany table, the expensive candles, and the refined atmosphere of their Portsmouth sanctuary were all built on a foundation of exclusion. And as the clock ticked past 3 p.m., I realized that the woman they feared, the disciplined, observant captain they found so intimidating, was exactly who I needed to be to survive this final domestic betrayal. They wanted a ghost, and by God, I was going to show them exactly how haunting a ghost could be when she finally decided to stop protecting the people who had never truly stood behind her. I sat in the driver's seat of my Ford F-150, the vibration of the idling 3.5-liter EcoBoost engine humming through the steering wheel and into my palms as the relentless New Hampshire rain blurred the world outside into a smear of gray and charcoal. The interior of the truck smelled of old coffee and the faint metallic scent of the toolbox I kept in the back, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed air of the Portsmouth mansion I was no longer allowed to enter. With a steady hand, I reached into the center console and pulled out a worn, grease-stained field notes notebook, the kind I had carried in the cargo pocket of my OCPs through dusty mountain passes and humid jungle training cycles. I flipped to a clean page and, using a black tactical pen, drew a single uncompromising vertical line down the center of the paper, labeling the left column family loyalty and the right column reality. As the rain drummed a rhythmic hollow cadence against the roof of the cab, I looked at the left side and realized with a piercing crystalline clarity that it was entirely blank, a void where I had tried for 3 decades to scribble excuses for people who had never actually earned them. The right side of the page, however, began to fill rapidly with the jagged shorthand of 20 years of systemic neglect, a catalogue of missed birthdays while I was stationed at Fort Bragg and forgotten achievements that were eclipsed by Victoria's latest minor drama. I noted the time I graduated from Ranger School and received a brief 3-sentence email from Priscilla while she was busy organizing a $5,000 launch party for Victoria's short-lived organic candle business. I wrote down the precise dates of the holidays I spent eating lukewarm MREs in a literal combat zone while Jerry and Priscilla were uploading high-definition photos of their 22-pound heritage turkey to Facebook, never once tagging the daughter who was the reason they could sleep soundly in their 600 thread count sheets. I realized in that moment, as the heater struggled to keep the windshield clear, that love in this family was not a reciprocal bond or a debt that could ever be collected through service and sacrifice. It was a binary choice they had made every single day to look past me. If they had chosen to erase me from the guest list of their lives to appease the ego of a woman who viewed my trauma as a social inconvenience, then I would simply choose to build a sprawling, vibrant world where they no longer held a single square inch of territory. The days of me begging for a folding chair at the kids' table or waiting for a maybe next year phone call that only came when the furnace broke were officially terminated at 3:12 p.m. on this Tuesday. The decision felt as cold, heavy, and surgically precise as a mission brief delivered in a darkened TOC before a high-value target extraction, leaving no room for sentimentality or the jagged edges of regret. I watched a single droplet of rain trace a jagged path down the glass, mirroring the way I was now cutting them out of my internal narrative with the same clinical efficiency I used to map out an infiltration route. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no tearful phone calls, and no more attempts to bridge a chasm that they had spent my entire adult life widening for their own comfort. As I shifted the truck into drive, the gears engaging with a familiar mechanical thud, I knew that family wasn't defined by the blood spilled in the past, but by who stayed when the tactical situation turned dire. They had retreated, and I was moving forward into the storm alone, finally unburdened by the weight of a loyalty that had only ever been a one-way street. I did not shed a single tear as I shifted the Ford F-150 into gear and drove away from the phantom life I had tried so hard to maintain, because a soldier who has seen the sun rise over the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush knows that emotion is a luxury you cannot afford when the tactical situation shifts against you. Instead of retreating to my cramped apartment to wallow in the rejection of a 3-sentence text message, I directed the truck north toward the rolling hills of New Hampshire, navigating the winding backroads until I reached the heavy wrought iron gates of Maplewood, a 30-acre sanctuary of prime timber and glacial soil valued at $2.4 million. This estate was my grandfather's final silent rebellion against the superficiality of his own children, a legacy he had deeded specifically to me in a private codicil to his will that my greedy sister Victoria knew absolutely nothing about. As the tires crunched over the wet gravel of the long maple-lined driveway, I felt the weight of the Monroe name shifting from a burden of expectation into a foundation of power. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the grand study, where the air was thick with the comforting masculine scent of aged Italian leather, cedarwood, and the faint dusty ghost of the expensive pipe tobacco my grandfather used to smoke while we sat by the hearth. I sat down at the massive scarred mahogany desk that predated my parents' suburban status symbols by half a century and opened my dark gray MacBook Pro, the glow of the Retina display illuminating the sharp lines of my face in the darkening room. My first move was to pull up my primary savings account, watching the digital numbers flicker until they settled on a solid $82,400, a war chest I had meticulously built from hazard pay, reenlistment bonuses, and years of living well below my means while my sister was busy charging designer handbags to our father's American Express Platinum card. With a steady hand and a mind sharpened by a decade of logistics and command, I opened a fresh Excel spreadsheet and titled it Operation Maplewood in bold black letters. This was no longer about a simple holiday meal or a desperate bid for familial acceptance. It was about the strategic fortification of my own life and the systematic dismantling of the influence my parents and sister held over my sense of worth. The spreadsheet began to fill with precise line items, from the cost of hiring a high-end catering firm out of Boston to the professional landscaping crew I would task with restoring the estate's dormant gardens to their former glory. I wasn't just planning a dinner for the few real friends who had actually stood by me during my deployments. I was building a fortress of independence that would serve as a permanent reminder of what I was capable of achieving without their patronizing approval. Every cell I filled in that spreadsheet was a calculated strike against the narrative that I was merely the intimidating, broken soldier who didn't count in the grand scheme of the Monroe family's social standing. I spent hours in that quiet, cedar-scented room, mapping out the renovation of the guest house and the installation of a state-of-the-art security system, treating the restoration of Maplewood with the same intensity one would apply to a forward operating base. By the time the clock on the mantel struck 11 p.m., the blueprint for my new reality was complete, and for the first time in my life, the silence of the house didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like the quiet before a decisive victory. I was done being a ghost in their house, and now I was going to be the master of my own, ensuring that when the truth of my inheritance finally came to light, it would be the most expensive lesson in loyalty my family had ever been forced to learn. The transformation of Maplewood from a silent, dusty museum into a vibrant command center of hospitality began with a series of decisive, high-value maneuvers that felt more like a logistical surge than holiday planning. I authorized a wire transfer of $12,300 to cover the initial preparations, a sum that would have made my mother Priscilla gasp in horror but to me represented a strategic investment in my own sanity and social sovereignty. I bypassed the local boutiques in Portsmouth and went straight to a premier catering firm in Boston, a high-end operation known for handling black-tie events at the State House, and I secured a full crew of chefs and servers who arrived with the disciplined efficiency of a flight deck team. I didn't just order groceries. I sourced 3 25-pound organic free-range turkeys from a heritage farm in Vermont and commissioned a custom-built, solid white oak dining table that stretched nearly 20 feet through the grand dining hall, capable of seating 24 people comfortably on chairs upholstered in deep navy velvet. While my parents were likely fussing over the placement of a single sprig of rosemary on their $6,000 mahogany table, I was building a stage for a much larger and more meaningful production. I spent 3 consecutive evenings in the study, lit by the warm glow of a desk lamp, handwriting 15 formal invitations on heavy, cream-colored cardstock that felt substantial and significant in my hands. These weren't sent to social climbers or business associates, but to the misfits, the chosen family who had actually seen me bleed and sweat in places that didn't appear on a travel brochure. I addressed envelopes to my military brothers from the 10th Mountain Division, men who had shared cold cans of hash in the dark and who understood the weight of a silent room, and to my Aunt Margaret, the only blood relative with the courage to see through Victoria's manipulative facade and the integrity to call out my parents' blatant favoritism. I also included my closest friends from the Veterans Outreach Program, people who knew that a uniform doesn't erase a soul but rather tempers it. Every stroke of my pen was a deliberate act of reclamation, inviting the people who valued Danielle the woman, not Danielle the useful tool or the intimidating soldier. I wanted the atmosphere of Maplewood to be the absolute, undeniable antithesis of the stiff, judgmental air that permeated my parents' house, where every conversation was a minefield and every laugh was measured for its social impact. I envisioned a house filled with the smell of roasting sage and slow-simmered dark chocolate, the sounds of unbridled, loud laughter echoing off the high cedar ceilings, and a total absence of the suffocating hierarchy that Victoria used to maintain her status as the golden child. There would be no assigned seating based on perceived worth and no hushed whispers about who was doing enough with their life. Instead, there would be warmth, genuine connection, and the kind of rowdy, soulful joy that comes from being surrounded by people who have nothing to prove to one another. I spent $400 on high-quality beeswax candles and another $2,000 on a curated selection of wines from a boutique vineyard in the Finger Lakes, ensuring that every sensory detail signaled a transition from the cold exclusion of my past to the inclusive fortress of my future. As I licked the last stamp and pressed it onto the final envelope, I felt a sense of mission success that no metal could ever match, knowing that while my family was closing their doors to me, I was opening the massive oak portals of Maplewood to a world that was far more real than the one they were trying to protect. By 4 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day, the cold and damp New Hampshire air had been completely transformed within the boundaries of Maplewood, turning the 30-acre estate into a radiant bastion of warmth and genuine connection that stood in stark, defiant contrast to the sterile silence I knew was currently suffocating my parents' dining room. While Priscilla and Jerry were likely meticulously adjusting the silver settings on their $6,000 mahogany table and speaking in hushed, guarded tones to avoid upsetting Victoria's fragile sensibilities, my grandfather's house was vibrating with the raw energy of a life fully lived. The atmospheric composition of the Great Hall was a rich, intoxicating blend of slow-roasted mountain sage, the earthy sweetness of caramelized yams, and the sophisticated oaky amber notes of high-end Pappy Van Winkle bourbon that I had decanted into heavy crystal tumblers for my guests. Outside, on the expansive stone patio that overlooked the frost-dusted valley, we had ignited a massive bonfire using seasoned hickory and applewood, the orange flames leaping 12 feet into the darkening sky with a roar that could be heard and seen clearly from the main road, serving as a literal beacon of my independence. My guest list was a tactical assembly of substance and character, featuring a local fire chief who had pulled more people from burning wrecks than Victoria had ever had. Monty Pettis, a renowned neurosurgeon from Mass General who spoke with the quiet humility of a man who daily held lives in his hands, and 3 of my closest combat veterans who had navigated the literal valley of death by my side. We were not merely consuming a meal prepared by a $12,000 catering team. We were actively celebrating the profound realization that family is a conscious choice rather than a biological sentence. And the air was thick with the kind of booming, unscripted laughter that only occurs when people feel truly safe and seen. I had made the deliberate decision to wear my Army service uniform, the dress blues crisp and midnight dark with the 2 bronze stars and the captain's bars catching the flickering firelight, not out of a sense of shallow vanity or a need to brag, but as a visceral physical reminder to myself of the rank, authority, and respect I had bled to earn in a world that existed far beyond the toxic, narrow borders of my parents' expectations. The contrast between the 2 households was an ocean of difference, as my guests moved through the cedar-scented rooms with a sense of ease and belonging that no amount of expensive wallpaper or French lace could ever buy. I watched the fire chief swap stories with the neurosurgeon over plates of organic turkey and artisanal stuffing, their voices rising in a genuine harmony that made the very foundations of Maplewood feel alive again for the first time in decades. There was no hierarchy here, no tiptoeing around a golden child's insecurities, and absolutely no one who viewed my service or my scars as an inconvenience to be managed. I stood at the head of the oak table, my posture straight and my eyes clear, looking at the faces of the people who had stayed when the world turned cold, and I felt a sense of completion that was as solid as the granite hills surrounding us. The $1,200,000 suburban house in Portsmouth felt like a dollhouse from this vantage point, a small and fragile thing built on the shifting sands of pretense, while here at Maplewood, we were building something indestructible. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the bonfire cast long, dancing shadows across the lawn, I realized that the empty seat at my parents' table wasn't a loss for me, but a vacuum in their lives that they didn't even have the depth to understand. I was no longer the daughter who didn't count. I was the master of a fortress, surrounded by giants of character, finally home. The execution of my silent counteroffensive occurred not through a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation, but through the cold and calculated medium of social media at exactly 6:12 p.m., a time when I knew Victoria would be retreating to her phone to escape the stifling boredom of our parents' quiet dining room. My sister, a woman whose entire sense of self-worth was precariously tethered to the curated status of her Instagram feed, could not resist the urge to check my profile, and what she found there was a surgical strike against her carefully constructed reality. She was met with high-definition images of the $2.4 million Maplewood estate, a property she had spent years dismissing as a worthless money pit and a crumbling relic of our grandfather's eccentricities, now glowing with the warm, expensive radiance of professional architectural lighting and overflowing with a guest list that would make our mother Priscilla's head spin. The photographs captured the grand dining hall in all its glory, the 20-foot white oak table laden with heritage turkeys and crystal decanters of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon, surrounded by men and women of genuine influence and character who moved through the cedar-scented rooms with an ease she could never emulate. The crowning blow, the moment that I knew would shatter her composure into 1,000 jagged pieces, was a candid video of Aunt Margaret, the undisputed matriarch of the Monroe bloodline and the only person whose opinion Jerry and Priscilla actually feared. Aunt Margaret was captured standing at the head of my table, her silver hair shimmering under the vintage iron chandelier, as she raised a glass of vintage Krug champagne to offer a toast to the only Monroe with a spine and a heart big enough to build her own kingdom. I didn't need to send a single text message or make a pathetic scene to reclaim my dignity, nor did I need to respond to the frantic, panicked bubbles that I knew would soon start appearing on my phone screen as the realization of her own exclusion began to settle in. I simply allowed the undeniable reality of my success and the physical manifestation of my inheritance to settle over her like a bitter, unforgiving New Hampshire winter frost, a cold front that revealed exactly how small her world had become. While she was sitting in a $1 million house that was essentially a gilded cage maintained by our parents' dwindling retirement funds, I was standing on 30 acres of prime debt-free land that I owned outright, surrounded by a fire chief, a world-class neurosurgeon, and the brothers-in-arms who had seen me lead through the darkest nights of my life. The contrast was a clinical, devastating demonstration of power that required no explanation and offered no apologies, stripping away the illusion that she was the golden child and I was the intimidating outlier. I watched the likes and comments from our extended social circle pour in, a digital tide of validation for the daughter they had tried to erase, and I felt a profound, quiet satisfaction in knowing that the silence coming from my end was the loudest statement I could ever make. There was no anger left in me, only a sharp military-grade clarity as I realized that by trying to keep me away from their table, they had inadvertently forced me to build a much grander one of my own. As the bonfire roared outside, casting long and defiant shadows across the frosted lawn of Maplewood, I took a slow sip of my bourbon and let the heavy oak door of the past swing shut for the very last time, leaving Victoria and my parents to freeze in the shadow of the fortress I had built without them. By exactly 7:30 p.m., the digital silence I had maintained was shattered by a frantic rhythmic buzzing that vibrated against the heavy mahogany surface of my grandfather's desk, a desperate electronic death rattle as my phone began blowing up with the panicked energy of a collapsing dynasty. I looked down at the illuminated lock screen to see 14 missed calls from my mother, Priscilla, whose primary concern was likely the sudden shift in social optics now that the family matriarch Aunt Margaret was visibly endorsing my sovereignty over Victoria's carefully curated boredom. There were 8 increasingly hysterical text messages from Victoria, her words bleeding through the screen in a torrent of wounded entitlement and frantic questioning that laid bare her sudden, terrified realization that the money pit she had mocked was actually a $2.4 million fortress of heritage and stone. "How could you invite Margaret and not us?" she had typed, followed immediately by a string of messages demanding to know why she hadn't been informed that Maplewood looked like a spread from Architectural Digest rather than the crumbling relic she had imagined. "You are being so divisive, Danielle," my mother had added in a separate thread, attempting to weaponize the very concept of family unity that they had so casually discarded at 8:14 a.m. that same morning when they told me I didn't count. The sheer hypocrisy of their outrage was a cold, clinical fascination to me, but I felt no urge to engage in the familiar draining cycle of justification and apology that had defined my first 34 years of existence. Instead of typing a response or descending into a shouting match that would only serve to validate their sense of importance, I picked up the iPhone 15 Pro Max with a steady, unhurried hand and walked toward the grand hallway, where a small lead-line security box sat on a Victorian console table near the heavy oak front doors. I placed the device inside the box and snapped the heavy latch shut, effectively severing the last tether to their manufactured drama and burying their frantic voices beneath a layer of physical and metaphorical shielding. As the lid closed, I felt a profound, internal silence take root. A tactical peace that I had earned through a decade of service and a lifetime of being overlooked by people who valued the price of a mahogany table over the character of the daughter who helped them move it. I turned back toward the great hall, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon wood smoke and the genuine, unforced camaraderie of my chosen family. And for the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel like the understudy waiting in the wings for a role I was never destined to play. I walked back to my guests, my dress blues catching the warm amber light of the chandelier, and took my place at the head of the oak table not as a daughter seeking approval, but as the undisputed commander of my own life and the sole architect of my future. The neurosurgeon was laughing at a story the fire chief was telling about a botched rescue in a snowstorm, and Aunt Margaret caught my eye from across the room, giving me a slow, knowing nod that signaled the passing of the torch from one generation of Monroe strength to the next. Family, I realized as I sat down and picked up my crystal glass of Pappy Van Winkle, isn't the blood that flows through your veins by accident. It is the group of people who stand in the breach with you when the world turns cold and the truth finally comes out. I had spent 34 years defending a perimeter for people who wouldn't even open the door for me, but tonight behind the stone walls of Maplewood I was finally home, surrounded by giants and completely, beautifully unreachable. The aftermath of that rainy Tuesday was as swift and devastating as a precision-guided strike, dismantling the very foundation of the Monroe family's carefully curated social standing within 48 hours of the last guest departing from the gates of Maplewood. The catalyst for the collapse was Aunt Margaret, the true matriarch and the only person in our bloodline whose moral compass had never been skewed by the lure of suburban pretension or the intoxicating vapors of Victoria's manufactured fragility. After she stood in my grandfather's study and read the cold, clinical text message from Priscilla at 8:14 a.m. stating that I didn't count, her reaction was a masterpiece of silent, financial execution that sent shockwaves through my father's professional life. Margaret didn't scream or make a scene. She simply contacted her personal attorney and moved her entire $500,000 investment portfolio away from Jerry's boutique wealth management firm, a move that didn't just cost him a commission, but stripped him of the prestige that came with managing the Monroe family's ancestral capital. The fallout within Victoria's own household was equally explosive, as the reality of her tactical error began to dawn on her husband, a man whose entire personality was built on the shaky pillars of networking and high-level social connections. When he realized that his wife had systematically burned the bridge to a sister who was not only a decorated captain but also the sole owner of a $2.4 million estate frequented by the state's political and medical elite, his facade of the supportive spouse evaporated instantly. I heard later through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances that their perfect $300 per person Thanksgiving dinner ended not with a toast to family, but in a visceral, screaming match over the gleaming white marble countertops of their kitchen. They argued for hours about who was truly to blame for losing access to Maplewood, with Victoria's husband realizing that her petty jealousy had effectively locked them out of the most significant asset in the family's portfolio. While they were drowning in the bitter waters of their own making, blaming one another for the exclusion of the daughter they had deemed intimidating, I remained behind the heavy stone walls of my fortress, finally unburdened by the weight of their expectations. The $6,000 mahogany table in Portsmouth was now a silent witness to their fragmentation, while my white oak table at Maplewood had become a symbol of a new, authentic legacy built on merit and mutual respect. I realized then that my parents' greatest mistake wasn't just erasing me from a dinner invitation. It was failing to recognize that the strength they found so uncomfortable was the very thing that could have saved them from their own insignificance. They had spent years trying to make me small so that Victoria could feel big, only to discover that when they pushed me out, I took the entire weight of the family's integrity with me. Now the silence from my phone, which remained in its lead-lined box, was no longer a source of pain, but a badge of victory that confirmed my status as the commander of my own destiny. Family, I have learned through the grit of the desert and the cold reality of this betrayal, isn't about the blood that flows through your veins or the name on a birth certificate. It is about who stays in the foxhole with you when the social optics turn ugly. As I walked the 30 acres of my land, watching the frost settle on the ancient maple trees, I felt a deep, philosophical peace in the knowledge that I had finally built a world where I didn't have to beg for a seat at the table. I was the table, I was the host, and for the first time in 34 years, I was exactly where I was meant to be, surrounded by the echoes of a grandfather who knew that character is the only currency that never devalues. My sister was left with her white Porsche and her dwindling social capital while I was left with the truth, and in the end, the truth was the only fortress I ever really needed. The establishment of my own personal no-fly zone was the final tactical maneuver in a lifelong campaign for a respect that Jerry, Priscilla and Victoria were fundamentally incapable of providing. On a crisp Monday morning, sitting at the heavy oak desk in the Maplewood study with the sunlight reflecting off the polished brass of my grandfather's antique compass, I drafted a single, uncompromising formal email that would serve as the terminal point for 3 decades of emotional labor. To my parents and my sister, I wrote with the cold, surgical precision of a field report, informing them that any and all future communication regarding the estate, my personal well-being, or my professional life would be handled exclusively through my attorney, Marcus Thorne, whose billing rate of $550 an hour was a price they would now have to pay just to utter my name. I explicitly stated that they were not to visit the 30-acre property, they were not to call my personal line, and most importantly, I made it clear that their collective comfort, the very thing they had prioritized over my humanity for years, was no longer a variable in my personal equation. After clicking send, I didn't wait for the inevitable influx of excuses or the manipulative guilt-tripping that had once held me hostage. Instead, I systematically blocked their numbers across all platforms and contacted the security firm to change the encrypted gate code to the Maplewood entrance. The moment the new 6-digit code was saved into the system, I felt a physical sensation of 20 years of psychological weight lifting off my shoulders, a pressure release more profound than shedding 60 pounds of combat gear after a 14-hour foot patrol. For 34 years, I had functioned as the understudy in a play written by narcissists, a daughter constantly seeking the elusive nod of approval from a father who valued his Porsche Cayenne over my bronze stars, and a mother who viewed my service as an inconvenient smudge on her social calendar. Now, as I walked the perimeter of my land, the air smelling of damp earth and late autumn pine, I realized that I was no longer a subordinate or a ghost haunting the edges of their gilded suburban lives. I was the sovereign commander of my own kingdom, standing on a foundation of granite and historical legacy that they could never touch. I looked at the heavy wrought iron gates at the end of the long maple-lined driveway and knew that they were finally, irrevocably closed to the people who had told me I didn't count. I spent the afternoon in the guest house, which I was converting into a state-of-the-art home gym and tactical recovery suite, realizing that the silence of my phone was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. There would be no more frantic calls to fix their furnace in a blizzard, no more maybe next year holiday snubs, and no more watching Victoria spend $14,000 of our parents' money on a spiritual retreat while I worked 3 jobs to stay afloat. I had taken the bricks they used to build a wall against me and used them to construct a fortress that was entirely my own, a place where character, service and loyalty were the only currencies accepted at the gate. As the sun dipped below the New Hampshire horizon, casting a deep violet hue over the rolling hills of my estate, I stood on the porch with a glass of neat bourbon and felt a sense of completion that required no audience and no external validation. I had finally achieved the ultimate mission objective. I had replaced a family of blood with a family of choice, and in doing so, I had transformed from a rejected soldier into the master of my own universe, leaving the toxic remnants of the Monroe name to wither in the cold shadow of the legacy they were too small to inherit. This wasn't a sequel or a new chapter. It was the final, definitive victory in a war for my own soul, and for the first time in my life the perimeter was secure. The evening air at Maplewood carries a crisp, biting edge that serves as a constant, bracing reminder of my own liberation, a stark departure from the suffocating, perfumed heat of my parents' artificial sanctuary in Portsmouth. I am currently reclined in a heavy Adirondack chair crafted from reclaimed barn wood, my boots resting on the stone ledge of the wraparound porch while I slowly rotate a heavy crystal tumbler containing 2 fingers of 12-year-old Macallan Sherry Oak, a $120 bottle that I bought for myself to mark the day the probate was finalized. The amber liquid catches the dying light of a New Hampshire sunset, casting long fractured shadows across the frost-dusted lawn that rolls down toward the dark, glass-like surface of the lake at the edge of the 30-acre estate. The house behind me is silent, but it is a full, resonant and deeply peaceful quiet that vibrates with the echoes of the laughter and the heavy, honest boots of the veterans and friends who filled these rooms just days ago. I have come to the profound, unshakable realization that family is not a biological obligation or a debt inscribed in the double helix of one's DNA, but a conscious, daily choice made by the people who have the integrity to stay when the tactical lights go out and the social optics turn ugly. I have spent my entire adult life as a secondary character in Victoria's long-running drama of manufactured victimhood, a shadow figure who was only summoned when there was a furnace to be fixed, a heavy piece of furniture to be moved, or a patriotic talking point to be exploited during a country club brunch. My sister, the golden child who navigated 37 years of life without ever feeling the weight of a responsibility or the sting of a consequence, had successfully convinced Jerry and Priscilla that my very existence was a threat to her delicate sensibilities. They had built a table designed for exclusion, a $6,000 mahogany altar where my service was ignored and my presence was eventually erased via a cold 8:14 a.m. text message. But as I sit here on the porch of a $2.4 million fortress that is legally and morally mine, I recognize that their rejection was the greatest tactical advantage I was ever given, forcing me to retreat from their toxicity and build a kingdom of my own design. Every seat at my new white oak table is now occupied by individuals of immense character, men and women who have seen me at my worst and stayed to help me find my best, from my brothers-in-arms to Aunt Margaret, who chose the truth of my character over the convenience of my father's investment firm. The $1,200,000 house in Portsmouth, with its silent rooms and its brewing resentment, feels like a distant, insignificant outpost compared to the sovereignty I have established here among the maples and the granite. I no longer feel the need to justify my rank, my scars, or my silence to people who were only ever interested in what I could do for them rather than who I was as a person. The weight of 20 years of seeking approval from narcissists has been permanently discarded, replaced by the solid, grounding reality of ownership and the fierce loyalty of a chosen tribe. As the sun finally slips below the horizon, leaving a bruised purple and orange glow across the sky, I take a final, deliberate sip of the Macallan and feel the warmth spread through my chest, an internal fire that matches the one I have built for myself. I have successfully established a perimeter that no manipulative email or frantic phone call can ever breach again, and the silence of the woods is a symphony of victory that requires no further explanation. Family isn't about the blood you share. It is about the courage to stand in the breach for one another, and while Victoria and my parents are left to squabble over the remnants of their fading influence, I am standing on solid ground, looking out over a future that I finally, completely and unapologetically own. The mission to reclaim my life is complete, the objective has been secured, and for the first time in 34 years, the commander of Maplewood is finally at peace.